My name is Harvey Gantt. I'm a principal with Gantt Huberman Architects, which is a division of the Bergman Company. Well, I grew up in a salt-of-the-earth working-class family in Charleston, South Carolina. We lived in a very small neighborhood. I went to a school in Charleston. Those schools were segregated at the time. Red Elementary School, Burke High School. Graduated second in my class. Developed an early interest in drawing and sketching in the fifth grade by a very insightful fifth grade teacher. And I sketched and drew from the fifth grade on, and I still do it even today. And it was in the ninth grade in Burke High School that I decided I wanted to become an architect and started to look around for schools to go to. And ultimately, after evaluating Howard University, A&T State University, Tuskegee, all of which were all black institutions back in those days, in the late 50s. I got a guidance counselor who advised that I might want to look at predominantly white schools also, and ultimately ended up at Iowa State University for a couple of years. And then after deciding that the cold weather was just not my speed, I decided to come back decided that Clemson University was a good alternative. I wanted to practice architecture in the South. I wanted to make my contacts there in the South, and it occurred to me that a lot of the people I would make contact with in cold Iowa were not going to be in the South. So for a lot of good reasons, it made sense to go to school closer to home, and Clemson was a good alternative. And but I couldn't ignore the fact that no one had ever gone to Clemson who was an African American before. So in the winter of 1961, I made an application to Clemson and made 4 or 5 subsequent applications for each term, and finally filed a lawsuit in the summer of 1962. And trials occurred in the fall, and the winter of 1963, I was admitted as the first African American student in the architecture school at Clemson. When I went to school, the architects we emulated, the masters at that time, were all from the Modernist school, the Walter Gropius School of Architecture, Le Corbusier, Louis Kahn, and many others back in that time, and even the younger architects that were surfacing on the scene were people who were practicing form following function and simplicity in the design and forms itself. So just about everything I did, in fact, I never did a Beaux-Arts type building. None of us did the old classical designs that were probably much more prevalent in the earlier part of the 20th century. We were all excited about these new architects that came and followed World War II and were exploding the world in terms of their designs at that time. And most architecture schools in the South, and I think across a large part of the country, were pushing this kind of exploration of new forms in a more modern context, without the frills and what I call the gingerbread that we used to put on the buildings. A window was a window was a window, and a wall was a wall and a wall, and a form was a form, and you tried to put those into pleasing shapes that made people feel good. Anyway, when I got out of school, I went to a firm like Odell Associates, which was a prominent firm here in North Carolina, and perhaps in the Southeast. And one of the reasons that I went there, aside from the fact that they offered me a job, was that it was interesting to see the designs that they were using. They were doing some very cutting-edge kinds of things. The first Coliseum here in Charlotte was one that I remember, at a wonderful church that they did over in Belmont, South North Carolina. And various elementary schools like Double Oaks were all very contemporary designs. In fact, they look a lot like the stuff that we were doing in college. And so I got attracted to the firm and was hired into their design department. And that's really where I started to really begin to feel in love with modern architecture. But to supplement my income, on my kitchen table, people would come to me, African American professionals in the community, that probably couldn't go to some of the subdivisions that they wanted to, so they often bought lots in fledgling suburban areas that weren't fully developed, and they needed someone to design a house that they wanted to do, and they've heard that this young architect was in town, and so they hired me to do their blueprints, as they used to call them. And it was another chance for me to express myself in terms of what I thought modern design was about in a residential context. I didn't get that opportunity to do it. Now, the question was, how did it evolve? How has it changed since the time I got out of school in 1965 to today? I think modern architecture has gone through a number of different changes. I can't even recount all the periods. But we had postmodernism and a kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but a lot of people got into starting to put gingerbread back on buildings, fins and decoration, and sometimes a recall back to the old classical period. And and also became very stylistic about what they did. I mean, Philip Johnson went from being the guy who did the Glass House to the guy who did the AT&T building in New York, and some of us who was fledgling architects in our 20s and 30s were beginning to get confused as to why were we abandoning this older form, which we thought worked so well, and another group simply saying, yes, these buildings need to be made more interesting. So people started talking about buildings with character and timelessness, and clients started asking for those kinds of things. But some of us sort of just stuck with, let's continue to design the buildings that actually where the function was expressed in many ways in the form of the building itself. And we had some good models here in this state and beyond. For us in Charlotte, Harry Wolff, for example, was a young architect that some of us went to work for. My partner did. And we continued to believe that modern was still better, although it could evolve from the purity of maybe what Gropius and others were doing back in the 30s and 40s and 50s to something else as an extension. It has to do with form. It has to do with expression of elements to the building and not covering it up. So a structure is a structure, and you put it in its proper context and in its proper place. A window is a window, and you don't embellish it with anything more than what that window needs to allow a light to come in. But because we now understand sustainability a lot more, today we might take a window and we might do something with it to help with the management of the overall thermal characteristics of the building itself. In the interest of sustainability, we will put sunscreens and sunshades and other kinds of elements on a building on a window, for example, to make it look different. We express the materials that we use for expressing buildings would tend to be modern in there. So rain screens are used quite a bit more, and we are using metal on buildings, and so sometimes the materials enhance the form of what the building is going to be like. Although for my own preference, brick has always still been an exterior material that I continue to like, and I think it ought to be used in a certain way to express what you want to have in a building. But we are not limited in modern architecture to some standard shape, a rectangle, a square. The building can follow and shape itself to the landscape. And when buildings do that, I think they are much more modern. A roof might be trying to tell some story about what's happening on the inside. I think of a sanctuary at a church. Some people like to make it flat. Some people want to make it flat with a clerestory up at the top. Some people want to raise it. Whatever your instincts might be, you will not be out of context in modern architecture, whereas if you were doing classical work, you had the front porch, the nave, and all of those had a specific expression and very little variation on that expression. Beautiful buildings, but I can take a classical church and many pre-modern architecture, sanctuaries, for example, churches, and they followed a certain pattern, they looked a certain way. But architects who practice modernism are not constrained by those particular forms. They are constrained by the function that the client and how the client might want to use this particular space, and they can form that space to fit that. That's the biggest difference to me. It's the form. What the client needs, it is a combination of what's been handed to you as the designer. And in most cases, you're given a unique site that's unlike any that may be existing. And you're given a unique program of what the client wants. And it's the architect probes to find out how the client would use those spaces. And the creativity comes into play then. You're putting these things together: site, client's needs, client's budget. I also suspect that one of the reasons that modernism rose to the top and became popular is because in a lot of ways we could build less expensively if people thought about it really hard. I mean, the craftsmanship often required to build many of the classical structures, the elements on the exterior of the building and interior for that matter, a lot of us can't replicate today, and we couldn't do because of cost. So when you take site, program, budget into consideration, modernism made a lot of sense for us because that's what you did. You shaped the building to fit the client's functional needs, but you also made sure that the budget was being met. The selection of materials, etc., all allowed for that to occur. My most enjoyable experience is going into one of my buildings and it's working. You can't replace that feeling with anything. Awards don't do it. Money doesn't do it in terms of a fee on the building. It could be the smallest building in the world if it works. And you remembered the client when they were in your conference room trying to tell you what they wanted to build. And you created something that actually worked for that client. And I don't mean work in the sense that people love it from a design standpoint and it gets a big architectural award, but it actually works and the client is happy in the space and people are happy in the space. That's what architecture is about. It's creating these memorable spaces that work, first for the person who paid for it and for the patrons or people that he wants to serve, whether it's a house, restaurant, church, or whatever. So my best feelings have always come in the aftermath. I love the creative part as we do it with the client. I had the guts to design the church that I go to every Sunday. And I say guts because if you go to something and you're the architect and it's not working and you're married to it through membership or even a house, you will live with that experience for the rest of your life. So if it's good, it's great. If it's not good, it's not so great. One of the best feelings I have is to go to Friendship Baptist Church on Sunday mornings. But I can remember when we were in these conference rooms here in this office and with models that we played around with and trying to create just this ideal sanctuary space that we wanted to make it work, and then bringing in the members of the deacon board and missionary society and showing them these ideas which were the furthest thing from their minds about what they wanted in the church. But when we talked about the play of light against shape and form in the space and how we could make the organ actually an artistic backdrop for the whole sanctuary and how we would treat the symbols of the church and where we would place them, and how we would emit light to the sanctuary. These were all ideas and concepts that were exciting. But the most excitement actually came when you got to sit in it, and you started to begin to feel that as the construction went forward. You got the shape right, you got this right, but it never really comes to full being until people are in it, and it's actually functioning just like you imagined, maybe even better than what you imagined. That's what makes you keep coming back. That's what makes you take your grandkids and show them what you've been doing. That's what the real excitement of architecture is all about. I think what I got out of that experience was that I could never earn a living designing houses, because I think it's actually the most intimate of designs that you can do. It is to do it right, you have to get to know the client far more intimately than you would get to know a client if you were doing an office building, even a school or anything else, maybe even a church. Because now you're talking to the client about the living space that they're going to be living in. And so I remember trying to spend time with Willie and Johnny Bullock or Dr. Nash. And here you got to remember, I was a 23-year-old architect. Not even licensed yet. And sitting with them trying to figure out what their lifestyle was. What is it that they like to do? Does she like to cook? If she likes to cook, you ought to celebrate the kitchen. If she likes reading, maybe good spots to curl up and read with proper lighting might be good. If he was an athlete and he, had a need to have some indoor games, how much space do you give him, and can they afford to allocate that kind of space? Or how much yard spaces of that site should you set aside to allow for basketball and other kinds of things? It was those kinds of crazy little intimate things you found out about them. So you actually, when they invited you to go somewhere to a party, or if they had something at their existing house, you try to go so you could get to see what they were like and how much the space that they were in was being constrained because the design wasn't quite what it needed to be. So when they talked about dining room meant something to me. Do you really dine, or do you want dining to be, do you want the dining room just to be a kind of a showpiece in the house? Because you really eat in your kitchen, or you really, those kinds of issues came across. And then you go to the paper and you try to put it on. I was working on my kitchen table, so you tried to sketch, and I do a lot of sketching before I do any real serious drawing to see whether or not we were getting what we wanted. And back then, we had to worry about the budget, and I think the budget, when I think about what the cost of the house was, it's amazing how cheap it was if you look at it today and what it would cost back then. But I got to watch the house go up, and I watched their excitement, as I did the other clients who I did the house for. And watching them go, and sometimes getting to go on a Sunday afternoon when they're walking through the rafters with the stud framing and all going up, and sort of saying, "Oh, you really got this right," or "Maybe you got this a little bit too small, and could we adjust this?" Or always hearing clients' expressions when they see the house in the ground on the site. Back then it was exciting to me, but very discouraging when they said, "I thought I designed a pretty big house for you, and this looks really small." But they didn't understand the nature of form itself, and that is when you are out in the big old world, anything looks relatively small until they actually saw it become three-dimensional. A lot of them changed their minds. But it was a fun period for me. It was a nice supplement to my income, but it was also fun for me to test out how I worked with clients and how well I could interpret. Much of what I think about architecture, even to this day, is how well can we extract what the user is thinking, and then put something creative in the place that they would be comfortable with. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That's the key. My early experience was with that, and juxtaposed against what I was working for in my real job, my real day job. And in my real day job, I was designing classroom buildings, a science building on the campus of Johnson C. Smith today. And those were great experiences, but they couldn't compare to the experience of working with people on a more intimate scale. But the time that it took to do those houses suggested to me that I'd never be able to do 10 or 12 or 15 of them and earn a living with anybody, because it just takes too much time. If I look back over the history of our firm, we have always been asked to take, in most cases, a bare bones budget and to do something significant. The challenge would be if someone walked in today and had a 2,000 square foot space, not a very big space, but they had X amount of dollars. The challenge would be, do we just give them something very pedestrian and because they don't have a lot of money, or do we in fact say, let's see how creative we can be with limited funds? In our career, most of our jobs have been limited funds because a lot of our work has been for the public sector, which meant that they never had generous budgets, adequate budgets, or sometimes not so adequate budgets. And so early on in the process, once we've gotten the program, we have to sit there and think, how creative can we be with this? How do we design that curvilinear roof and do it in such a way that it's not 4 times the cost of a more standard roof? And if we did do the curvilinear roof, what can we reduce costs on somewhere else to sort of put all our eggs in that particular basket, because we think that's a part of the building that's most important. So that my big challenge has always come at the beginning of the project. Numbers, budget, size, and then program, what it is that they want to do. And then how do we make it become something other than pedestrian? But that's the excitement of the creative process. That's what makes it very interesting. If I had a client that allowed me to spend $1,000 per square foot and he didn't particularly care what I did, that's not nearly as challenging as somebody who's serious about some particular thing they're wanting to accomplish, but they don't have much money, or they barely have enough money to do it. How do we do it? We knew early on that we were never going to get the big time budgets, because we were probably never going to design for very wealthy people. We were going to probably be doing a lot of things in the public arena. Education was one of those areas. We were going to be doing it with taxpayer funds in many cases. And therefore, our budgets were not going to be big, but this still didn't say we didn't have an opportunity to do things that were special and different and good. So my challenges were not so much any particular phase of the architectural process as much as it was putting this thing in context and saying, can we bring our creative skills to bear given the realities of time and budget? What advice would I offer to young architects? And I see them all the time because they're right here in this firm, some of them only a couple of years out of school. But we also see a lot of architects who come into this office to visit, and we talk with them. First, I'm always excited to see them because it takes me back to a time when I was a fledgling architect myself. It is a profession that you can gain a whole lot of satisfaction from because you can touch and feel what you actually have done. You can't imagine what satisfaction comes from that. It's almost like my sharing with you how I feel when I go into a project and it's working for my clients. It is not a profession that you will probably earn a huge income from. But if money isn't everything, and it isn't, the satisfaction you get from the creative process more than overcomes whatever deficit in salary you may have. But you have to be certain that this is what you want to do. And school is a good time to sort of test that. If you're excited about that studio project that you're going to go work on. Or if it's a chore, then you might not want to be an architect. Because those who want to do this, the best of those kinds of people, are very passionate about design, about building space, about accommodating people. And I've never seen an architect who doesn't really like people. You can't do it without liking people. But I've never seen an architect who is going to be really good. Really good. I've seen some prima donnas who gotten ideas that I just want to design this building because I think it's a great piece of artwork. To hell with the people who are going to be in it. But the best architects are the architects who care about people, passionate about design, and then care about how those people utilize that space and how memorable that space is.